In this session, we are going to talk about an incredibly popular tool that Nerdio has to offer, the Nerdio Cost Estimator. We know that one of the biggest challenges MSPs face in building a cloud practice in Microsoft Azure is deeply understanding the cost of purchasing Azure from their distributor, or in some cases directly from Microsoft. MSPs are concerned that in moving to a consumption-based selling model that they may accidentally quote their customers an incorrect or unrealistic price for Azure services. The Nerdio Cost Estimator aims to solve this challenge by providing MSPs with an easy-to-use tool that has taken into account all of the pricing challenges one may encounter when quoting Azure deals to their customers. We have organized our cost estimator by the most common use cases an MSP would deploy Azure. In the session today, we will walk you through the cost estimator, taking a look at IaaS, or the use case where a customer wants to take on-premise servers, move them to the cloud, and then manage them, auto-scale them, or back them up. Certainly one of the most common use cases in the market today. There will be further sessions where we go deeper into other use cases, including IT as a service and desktop as a service. Enjoy the session.
So there are a number of different ways you can do it. The hard way to do it, or maybe the one way to do it, is just provision what you think you need, let it run, and then next month see what it actually costs, right? That's one way to do it. It's probably the most precise way because it's not really an estimate. That's going to be an actual that's going to come out of Microsoft's billing system. It's going to tell you very precisely what things are cost, but you can obviously understand that's not acceptable in most scenarios because partners are offering this as a service to customers, and most customers don't want to have no idea as to how much something is going to cost them until after they've used it. So letting it run and seeing how much it costs is not really a viable way of pricing Azure. The other option is understanding in very great level of detail every piece of Azure infrastructure, every single type of resource, and how every single resource is built. So for instance, if you're going to be provisioning VMs, you'll need to understand that, okay, VMs consist of compute, which is CPU and RAM. They also need an OS disk. You also need to understand that there is a way of doing it as pay-as-you-go. You can reserve it for a year, reserve it for 3 years. You can bring your own license, or you can rent the OS license from the Azure subscription. And then you would need to understand all the different types of VMs that are out there, the B series, which are burstable, or the D series, which are not burstable, E series, which have high RAM to CPU ratio, etc. Then you would go in and kind of line by line assemble your architecture, right? So build out an architecture on paper, then go through and figure out what each and every VM will need. This VM is going to be of such and such size, and it's going to be, it's going to cost you, this much, and then it's going to have an OS disk that's going to cost you that much, right? So kind of go through the process manually. Obviously, very difficult, very time intensive. Certainly learn Azure really, really well by going through that process multiple times, but really not practical in most situations. So letting it run and seeing how much it costs after the fact, not feasible. Manually building an architecture and then pricing out each and every component, very difficult, and also probably not feasible just because chances of missing something are pretty high. The third way to do it is by using a tool that Microsoft provides called the Azure Pricing Calculator. And the Azure Pricing Calculator is very powerful and very robust type of a tool. It has all of the various Azure products, everything from compute, networking, and storage, all the way to all of the platform services such as web apps and SQL and all kinds of database and containers, everything else that Azure has. The focus of our discussions here are in these top 3 things, compute, networking, and storage. So if you're using the Azure Calculator, you would still need to somehow architect an Azure-based solution on paper or in Visio to figure out what's needed. But then you have a single place where you can come in and start putting things into a price estimate. So for instance, if you wanted to price out a VM, you can click on VM, you can give it a name, you can then select what region it's going to be in, what operating system it will run, whether or not it will have SQL Server on it. You can select the type of tier that this VM will run in. You'll select the instance based on how much CPU and RAM. You will then decide what to do with pay-as-you-go versus reservations. And then you would decide on the OS disk that goes into that VM, whether it's standard or premium, and if it's standard, how many transactions, etc. So this makes the job a little bit easier where you don't have to keep track of things manually. You don't have to have a million tabs open to know how to price, VMs and how to price storage. It brings it all together for you in one place. But as you can tell, this is still pretty labor intensive, and most importantly, it requires a starting point where you have an architecture already in mind or on paper to start building this quote. You can't just come in here and by building this quote figure out what the architecture must be, right? Because this is just helping you translate a desired state into what the components are in order to give you a price. So that's one way to do it. So that's the third method we discussed. One thing about this price estimator is you can go in and you can export it as a quote. It's going to give you a nice Excel spreadsheet with all the SKUs for each and every line item you've selected. You can save them, you can share them with others. So very, very functional and powerful tool. Requires you to have an architecture designed and requires pretty high level of understanding of what all the pieces are and how they work and what the differences are. So like if you're dealing with VPNs, it says, okay, you have all these different VPN types, but you don't really know what each one means. So then you have to go in and actually click on product details and understand that, there is this kind of tunnel and that kind of tunnel, and one costs more than the other one because it has different characteristics. So again, very price intensive type of a process, or labor intensive, I should say. So in order to provide an alternative and one that is easier for our partners to use, we created our own tool that does two things. It's designed to both architect a solution based on certain business level information about an IT environment without someone having the expertise and understanding all the nuances of Azure. So that tool architects it, and then through architecting it, it also prices it out and gives the partner a pretty good degree of control about turning things on and off. It also brings in a lot of the information needed to make decisions about VPN or about any other sort of components in line with the process of creating the quotes. Instead of having to go off on a separate page, read documentation, we provide that information kind of in little snippets and tooltips within that tool. The name of that tool is the NFA Cost Estimator, not to be confused with the Azure Price Calculator, right? So this thing is called Pricing Calculator. Our tool is called NFA Cost Estimator, and it takes into account not just Azure, but also things like RDS licensing, Office 365, and the cost of Nerdio. Now, the price calculator, one thing I wanted to mention is the public version doesn't really have a way of incorporating your discounts as a partner. So partners get certain level of discounts from maybe their distributor or from Microsoft directly. Like it doesn't integrate that. There is a way to log into your own partner portal, and sometimes Microsoft has a way of you running a cost estimator that has those discounts integrated. So that's one of the other things that the NFA Cost Estimator does, is it lets you incorporate those discounts into the overall analysis. And we're doing a lot of development and a lot of work on the cost estimator to improve it even better, to provide more information that's most relevant to the partners and make it as easy as possible for them to play with what-if scenarios. So with that introduction, let's start looking at the cost estimator. If we go to NFA Cost Estimator, this is going to open up a screen that looks like this, and it's going to tell us that there are four major cost components. There is Azure consumption, Office 365, RDS, and Nerdio licensing. And this tool will help you estimate the cost for each of the components. And the first thing you got to decide on is the use case for which you're going to be running this tool, right? So in the previous version of this, we did not have this selection. And then, people had to make a lot of decisions in line, sort of as they went through this screen. And what we decided to do is we're going to curate this a little bit, and we're going to ask them, okay, what are you really trying to accomplish? And there are 4 use cases here. We'll actually go through examples of each one. And we'll start with the simplest one all the way on the left, and then go to the most complete one all the way on the right, and then do the middle two. So let me explain what these use cases are. So the first one we call line of business servers. And the way to think about it is it's basically IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, that has no desktop component. The caption, I'll just read it out, says manage autoscale and backup line of business applications and databases in Azure, extend existing network and AD into Azure, configure autoscale and backup in DR of server VMs, manage the entire environment from an easy to use 3 clicks or less management portal. And if you select this option, you'll see below that selections will change. So it's going to reduce the number of options you have into 3 additional sections. So let's do this use case first. So the line of business use case doesn't have a desktop component, so there's going to be nothing that's tied to a user or to a desktop. Everything is going to be from a perspective of infrastructure. So section number 1 is servers. And you can see here there are by default, 3 servers that were placed onto this sheet right here, and you can see 2 of them have a delete button. So the first server is DCO1, which is the domain controller that gets provisioned in Nerdio, and that is a mandatory server that has to be part of the environment, even if it's not going to have any desktops. This is what NAP uses to orchestrate a lot of the AD configuration, Azure AD synchronization, and all kinds of other stuff that NAP does is all done through this DCO1. The second server that's common but not mandatory, right? It's been placed on this estimate because it's usually deployed but doesn't have to be, is a file server. So if someone wants to have an additional server for things like file or printers or some application that may be running in the cloud, again, remember there's no virtual desktops in this use case. So the file server would be used by mounting direct UNC or mapping drives over a VPN or something. So the file server was placed here. And then there is a third server that is basically, well, why would you be provisioning an Azure environment unless you had some application server, line of business server, as we call it, to actually put into Azure. So that's why there are 3. However, we can go ahead and we can actually delete them if we don't need additional ones. So once you have this section right here, we can go ahead and change the instance size of the domain controller. So the minimum it can start out with is a single core 3.5 gig of RAM VM, but it could be really anything else. A popular size that we're seeing that seems to work pretty well in small to mid-size environments is this burstable 2-core 8 gigs of RAM VM. So you can make that change. You can see the selector box is very convenient because you can use it as a drop down, but you can also type in any portion of anything here and it will automatically match it, even if it's not at the beginning of the line. So if I'm looking for something that has 64 cores, I'll just type in 64C and it's going to filter it down to everything that has 64 cores. If I need something with 32 gigs of RAM, then I have everything that has 32 gigs of RAM. So really nice, convenient drop down. The second selection is the OS disk. Okay, and again, we support 3 types of disks: S, which is standard HDD, E, which is standard SSD, and P, which is premium SSD. You'll recall that standard SSD and standard HDD also have operations associated with them. They're slower, and premium SSD does not have an operations related charge, and they're more expensive. So, if you're configuring DCO1 in the cloud, you may decide that you want an SSD disk. So you filter it down to SSD and you'll decide that you need a P10, which is 128 gigabyte premium SSD. The next selection is the data disk. Same thing here. It's optional. So there's a none selector here where there's not a none selector on the OS disk. That's mandatory. For a domain controller, you probably won't have a disk right here. If you're going to do FSL1, great. If you're not going to do FSL1, just delete that from the list. And then you can add additional servers. And by adding a server, you simply click on the add button. You can click it multiple times. One nice feature here is once you add this, so let's call this SQL01. Let's say there's going to be a database and an application server that you'll be hosting. You can then configure the size of that database server. So let's say we want a 4-core VM, and because it's a database, we need all the cores to be dedicated. So we'll use a D4 V3. We are going to have a slower, well, let's do a faster C drive, 128 gigs, and a larger, faster data drive of 512 gigabytes P20 right there. Now, when I click add another server, let's say I'm also going to have SQL02, what you'll notice is going to clone the settings of the previous server that I added. So instead of starting fresh with whatever the default was, it's actually going to give you the option of just, duplicating the previous option you selected. So let's say SQL02, same kind of configuration, but this one is going to be maybe, -test, and it needs slower disk. So instead of it being 512p, let's make it 512e, and we'll do the same thing here. We're going to do E10, which is the C drive of standard SSD. Okay, and you can obviously add more. So let's say we're also going to have an application server, and this application server is going to be an 8-core VM, and this 8-core VM is going to be, let's say, this D8 V3. It's going to have a P10 for an OS disk, and it's going to have no disk for the data. Okay, so that's how you configure the server section in the case of line of business's use case. So we now have 4 servers, and as you're making these changes, you can see over here on the right, and also this box basically floats from being at the top to kind of moving over to the side here. So as you're making changes, you can see what the effect is. So let's say you started out with a P10 and P20, and you're saying, okay, well, my Azure cost or my total cost is $1169, and now let's say I want to decrease this from a P20 to an E20. You will see that the cost, it went down by whatever that was, $12 or so. So you can kind of, on the side, quickly see what the impact of your configuration selections are on the cost of this thing. Once you're done selecting servers, you move on to the sections that we call other features. These are common things that get enabled when you are deploying the line of business server use case. So the first thing is this Azure hybrid usage. And you'll recall Azure hybrid usage is the right for you to not pay Microsoft for the OS license when you're running an Azure VM in Azure. You're not paying for the OS license if you are using the hybrid usage, meaning you're basically paying the rate you would be paying if you were running a Linux OS. So only the base compute rate, not the base compute plus the license OS. Now, if you don't pay Microsoft for that license, that means you have to bring that license on your own. And the way you bring that license on your own is either through a software assurance on existing Windows Server core licensing that you may already have, or through this program called CSP software subscriptions, which is a way of buying a subscription to Windows Server OS, either for 12 months or 36 months. And instead of having to rent it from Microsoft, you can bring it to the picture on your own and buy it by yourself. So if you change it from no to yes, that means you're going to take advantage of Azure hybrid usage. There's a link that gives you the details about exactly how that works. And if we change it from no to yes, you will see there will be a fairly significant decrease in price, right? So take a note that we just went from 1104 for the Azure component, because we only have VMs right now, and we went down by bringing our own license, we went down from 1104 to 561, which is really almost 50% savings of that cost, right? Almost exactly 50% savings. So you can see that when you rent a VM from Azure, a huge portion of what you're paying for is actually the license rental. And the way the things work out is if you have VMs that have CPU numbers of 4 and above, especially 8, 16, etc., then bringing your own license is definitely going to be more cost effective. And even having to purchase that license up front is going to be much more cost effective than renting it from Microsoft. Now, the caveat is if you bring your own license, that means you have to buy it as a subscription for 12 or 36 months, which means you have to pay upfront for that subscription. And if you decide that you don't need that server, halfway into a 36-month, test scenario, you already own that license and you can reuse it for another server, but you can't really return it or give it back. So paying for it upfront and making a commitment to a certain length of time in exchange for a fairly significant discount. Now, you'll also notice that when I changed from no to yes, one other line got added. This line is basically telling me how many cores of Windows Server I need. And here's how this works. If you're buying Windows Server through a CSP software subscription and taking advantage of Azure hybrid usage, the way you buy Windows is in packs of 8 cores. So packs of 8 cores, and each pack of 8 cores can cover one VM of up to 8 cores. What does that mean? So that means that if I have an 8-core VM, then I need a single 8-core pack to cover it. If I have a 16-core VM, I obviously need 2 of those core packs. However, if you have less than 8 or a non-integer multiple of 8, you need to round up. So that means that even if I have a 2-core VM, I still need to purchase an 8-core pack because that's the only way they get sold. They get sold in 8-core packs. So for this server, for this server, for this server, and for this server, I need a dedicated 8-core pack, which is where this number 32 comes from. It's pretty trivial when you're only dealing with servers, but when you start adding desktops and hybrid AD and all kinds of other components into it, especially things that scale in and out, figuring out the correct number of cores is far, far from trivial, and having this little line item that tells you what you need is very helpful. The next thing that's kind of a big lever in terms of cost is a reservation. A reservation is a way to basically prepay for a certain amount of compute in terms of a specific family in a specific Azure region and get a significant discount. Very similar conceptually to Azure hybrid usage, with a few exceptions. The similarities are you also select from either a 12-month or a 36-month commitment, and you prepay for it upfront in exchange for a fairly significant discount. The things where it's not similar is in the fact that you have to make a commitment to a particular family of VMs. So like B would be one family, D would be another family. So you have to buy reservations for family. As opposed to Azure hybrid usage, when you buy a license of Windows, it doesn't really matter which family it goes on, right? It can apply to D or B interchangeably. The other thing that's not similar is that you have to commit to a reservation in a particular physical Azure region. And that Azure region, your reservation is tied to that, as opposed to software subscriptions are, again, not tied to a region, not tied to a family. Also, with reservations, if you want to exchange a reservation, let's say you decide that you're going to go with B series VMs, but later on you discover that the burstable VMs are not a good fit for the workload, and you want to go from B to D or from D to NV, whatever the case may be, you can exchange your reservation either because you want a different family or because you want it to be in a different region. You first thought you're going to put it in the East, but then you decided to put it in Central. You can exchange your reservations with no penalty. So any unused portion of the reservation can be exchanged as a credit towards the purchase of a new one. So those are the differences. You can, it's tied to a family and tied to a region, but you can exchange the family and the region for no penalty. You can also cancel a reservation, unlike software subscriptions, which you cannot give back, you cannot cancel them. A reservation can be canceled, and there is a small 12% penalty for doing that. Now, 12% may be significant depending on how much capacity you're reserving, but the amount of savings, which we'll see in a minute, that provides you, significantly exceeds the potential penalty you may have. When would you have a penalty? In a case where you have a customer that maybe initially committed to 3 years and then they left, and now you have this reservation that you cannot reallocate to someone else. You have to cancel it and get a refund for the unused portion of it. When you get the refund for the unused portion, they subtract 12% of the initial purchase price. Now, let's see how much of a difference it makes. So right now, by default, you see we have set it for 3 years. If we set it to no, that's going to be the pay-as-you-go price. If we set it to no, so the price of Azure goes up to $997. Okay, so if it's $997 down to $561, so we're looking at $436, which is again a significant savings. And this savings varies by instance type. So if we had different instances selected up here, the savings would be different. Some of them have more, some of them get a larger percentage discount, some get less. So you see, again, this is a significant lever. So if we did 1 year, it would be somewhere in between those two numbers. So let's look at a pay-as-you-go price of Azure. If we did no hybrid usage and no reservation, our list price, let's make sure we don't have any discounts in here, we don't. Our list price for Azure would be $1,593. And if we decided to bring our own windows and reserve things for 3 years, we would save $1,000 or more even in that particular scenario. So very significant savings that's important to keep in mind when creating the solution. The next option is in-region backup. You can turn it on or off. By default, it's no. We can set it to yes. What this does is it calculates the cost of backup, making the following assumptions. So first of all, it's going to back up each and every server in this list. So there's a backup license fee that's associated with each server based on how much storage that server has. So if you recall, I think for every 500 gigabytes of storage that server has, you pay $10. So in this case, like DC01 will be $10, or maybe I think the first 512 is $5, whatever it is. There's a license fee there. But for example, SQL01, it has more than 512, so you're going to pay $20 for this SQL01. Something like that. And then there's also the storage fee that gets generated by creating those backups, and the assumptions that the cost estimator makes, which is what we commonly see, is that each disk that's listed in this section is going to be 50% utilized. So it's not going to be empty, and it's also not going to be 100% full. It's going to be about 50% utilized. You're going to have a 30-day retention of that data, and you're going to see a daily delta in that data of 2%. So so taking all of the data on all of these servers, which is going to be 50% of the total capacity of all the disks, and looking at 2% daily delta, which is about 60% monthly delta on that data. Is going to be your estimate of how much storage is going to be used. So again, calculating that manually, pretty difficult, certainly doable in the spreadsheet. All you have to do here is just change this from no to a yes, and it will calculate that cost for you. The next thing is the cost of out-of-region DR. This is using Azure Site Recovery, and this will add both the licensing and the storage utilization at another region. So that's something that's by default no, but you can set to yes. Then there's also the site-to-site VPN. So we can change it from no to yes. And you can see the cost is going to update. This is because a VPN gateway was added into the cost analysis. We also have hybrid AD. So hybrid AD, as you remember, is a way of extending an existing Active Directory into Azure when we enable hybrid AD, it calculates the cost of a number of things. It's first of all is going to add an additional server. This is going to be your hybrid AD server. So we gotta, maybe update that server for the right size. You'll also notice our number of cores has now changed because we now have an additional 8-core pack that has to be taken into account. This is a server that cannot be deleted because we have hybrid AD enabled. And also you can see by enabling hybrid AD, we can no longer disable VPN because that's also a mandatory component, right? So again, imagine doing all of this manually. If you wanted to do hybrid AD, you may account for the server, but forget to account for the VPN gateway. The NFA cost estimator takes care of all of that for you. Okay, so these are the other feature section. And then at the bottom, we get into the cost assumptions. These are pre-configured with some default values that we find to be common, but they can be overwritten and the partner can play around with them to understand what the impact is. So the first thing is storage operations. So, storage operations are generally charged a certain amount per 10,000 operations. Now, there's really no easy way for anyone to answer the question of, well, how many thousands or tens of thousands or millions of operations am I going to have on which disk in the course of the month? So instead of doing that, what we decided to do is tag on a small per gigabyte charge in addition to the storage charge to sort of proxy for the storage operation, with the assumption being that the more storage you have, the more operations you'll have. And the cost of those operations is going to be somewhat, relevant or relative to the cost per gigabyte. So for example, the cost of a gigabyte in premium storage is about 15 cents, and the cost of a standard storage gigabyte is about 4 cents, and the cost of a e-disk, which is standard SSD, somewhere in between that, right? So like 9 or 10 or something like that. So we're basically tagging on another 3 cents by default for every gigabyte for standard storage, right? So this tells you very clearly this is standard storage only, not premium storage. If we zero this out, you'll see that the total will decrease a little bit. However, if we had all of these disks set to P, so let's go through and do that. So if we set this to P, and this to P, and this one as well, right? So now we have P disks only, then basically this should not have any impact, right? Because it's only adding transactional cost to standard storage. The next thing is bandwidth, okay? And the way we're pricing bandwidth is by giving the partner the ability to estimate how much data they'll actually transfer out of the environment, to either another Azure region or to the internet. So inbound data is free. So this is asking how much outbound data will there be, right? So 1,000 gigabytes is about a terabyte per month. That's roughly equivalent to 3 megabits per second at 100% utilization during the month. Right? I just happen to know that because it's about 330 or so gigabytes that you can transfer if you're utilizing 1 megabit of bandwidth at 100%. So this is kind of just a rough estimate. Somebody will have to convert that to what they really think is realistic. Now let's see how sensitive it is to this number. So if we go from 1 to 1001, our cost has gone up from 687. So not much, but let's go from 1,000 to 2,000. So 687 to 674, right? So for every 1,000 gigabytes, it looks like we're adding whatever that was, $80 or so. Did I get that right? 674. Yeah, about $90 or so. Okay, the next thing is where the discounts can be specified. So a partner generally is buying Azure through their CSP provider or directly from Microsoft, and they could have various levels of discounts anywhere up to 15%, 8%, 9%, 5%, whatever it may be. So they can go in and type in their own discount, and then the calculator will take that into account. So let's say they have a 8% discount. That's going to apply it to the right place. The next thing is the Azure discount for reservations, right? So reservations get a different discount than standard type of storage. So when we apply a reservation discount, like you'll see, if I change this to 0, the price obviously going to go up. If I change it, to 5, I believe 5 is the maximum you can get on reservations. So let's leave that at 2. And then the final two selections are the region, and the price does vary a little bit per region, certainly if you go outside of the US. So let's say we are currently in South Central and we are at 667. Let's go to West US, and you can see that our price went up 667 to 708. It just has to do with the real-time availability of resources. And this data gets refreshed on a pretty regular basis. Now, if you go to Europe, we have 708 going down to 692. If we go to East Asia, our price went up to 869. So there is some variability depending on the region. And then finally, we also have support for various currencies for our international partners. So if you want to obviously do this, in Europe, and you wanted to see the price, there's a UK region in British pounds, it would convert that for you. Now, it's not based on any particular exchange rate. It's actually based on the published price of resources in the UK in British pounds. Good. Now, once you've completed this, and again, we only went through the simplest of the pricing scenarios, line of business, you have the total price right here. What you can then do is click View Costs, which is going to give you a more detailed breakdown. And let's look through this. So we have a per month price for the total environment broken down by category. So we have our Azure price, we have our Nerdio price, and we also have an AHU requirement of 40 cores. This is a summary of what we've turned on and off. So we've turned on to have backup, we've turned on to have hybrid usage enabled, we've selected 3 years of reservations, and we decided to not have DR. This is what we selected in terms of servers, so we know exactly that we're quoting the right thing. And then this section, before we look at the totals, let's look through here, breaks this cost, this 555 pounds, down into its subcomponents. So this is how much bandwidth is, this is how much server compute is, this is how much a backup is, this is what the server storage is going to be, this is how much site-to-site VPN is, and then all of the other assumptions we made, such as hybrid AD, the Azure region, CSP discount, whether we're using hybrid usage, etc. So all of that is also reflected here. And then this is what the average monthly price is. Remember, we selected 3-year reservation, so our analysis needs to be over the course of 36 months. So over 36 months, if you take 36 and multiply times this, you're going to get the total cost. But the way it actually breaks down is because you're buying reservations, you're going to pay this much, $93.20 upfront for the reserved instances. Plus, you're also going to need AHU 40 cores of that. And again, in a future version, we'll have that cost in here too. But for now, you need to calculate that separately. And then once you have this upfront, you then pay 304 pounds per month for the remaining 35 months. Okay, once you have this data calculated, you can label this estimate. There is a little edit button up here, and you can say this is going to be for Acme Corp. And then you are be able to click print, and this will generate a nice PDF file that will have all of that information listed. Now, this is the costs to the partner, not necessarily the price, or unlikely to be the price to the end customer. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. This is what the partner would pay to Microsoft based on the selections that they've made.